Big Ten video coming to you with Witty CFB. Purdue just fired Ryan Walters this morning, who is right now on an 11-game losing streak and failed to be an FBS opponent this year. First time since 1943 that they failed to win a conference game. And it just got to the point where it was just too much to handle in terms of Purdue. His overall tenure, 5-19 per Yahoo Sports. The buyout should be approximately $9 million, which is not awful for a academically rigorous school who does have a pretty significant endowment. So they definitely should have enough donors to get the ball rolling on that and to get the next head coach going into. And obviously, for people who don't know Purdue, I mean, the job is difficult for a number of reasons. You're in an academically rigorous school. Indiana is not the easiest place to recruit, particularly when you're competing against teams like Ohio and Michigan, a bunch of the MAC teams in there, and also all the teams in the Big Ten, like your Northwesterns, your Illinois, Ohio, and et cetera. So you have all those things going for you too. But also going into this year, you lost a number of recruits, not only before the season started, but also in this current recruiting cycle as well. In the 2025 class, they're ranked something like 96th in terms of recruiting class. So it's just been incrementally getting worse in terms of Purdue's overall long-term picture in terms of recruiting for Ryan Walters. And the writing was on the wall too. I mean, obviously he has a very impressive background being defensive coordinator at Illinois before taking the Purdue job. While he was there, they had the number one ranked scoring defense in the Big Ten. And, he's earned his stripes. He's a young coach, so he should have no problem getting back on the horse and finding a defensive coordinator job somewhere in a Power 4 school. But the Boilermakers are in an intriguing spot because as it stands right now, the only other team that you can make a legitimate argument who has a better job opening is probably North Carolina. And I'd say at this moment in time, North Carolina's job is probably a little bit better than Purdue in the sense of, yes, in Purdue, you are playing in the Big Ten. However, you are at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of where you're at. And, you can see the bottom of the tracker. Purdue ranks 131st in scoring defense and averaging about giving up 40 points a game. And the majority of their games, aside from, I think, 5 of those losses, have been by 2 possessions or more. And also a really messed up stat, too, if you want to hear this. If Purdue started off all of their games this season with a 34-point lead, they would only go 6-6 and barely squeak by and make a bowl game. So if that doesn't tell you the state that this program is in, statistically speaking, I think that's really a pretty pressing, damning sort of stat there. And when you look at this team on paper, I mean, you look at Darian Burks, who transferred. You look at Nick Scowden, who transferred from Texas A&M and has been a monster for them this year. And quite frankly, they just don't have a lot of playmakers and a lot of talent. I mean, you could look at Hudson Card, for example. He finished with 9 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, had some injury issues this year, balled out versus Illinois, and they barely won that game too. Because when they made the change in late September to go from Graham Harrell, when they fired Graham Harrell, in many ways, it seemed to me like it was Ryan Walters' sort of last attempt to try to resurrect this program and make it somewhat respectable. But when you lose 66-0 to Indiana, that's just kind of the writing on the wall where it says, hey, you just can't do this anymore too, especially with how big of a rivalry it is. And granted, I will defend Ryan Walters in the sense that you had a very difficult schedule this year. You played 5 ranked teams this year. You played against Notre Dame. You played against Penn State. You played against Oregon. You played against Ohio State. And you played against Indiana. So those are really tough matchups altogether. I don't care who your coach is. But for Purdue to be in this situation too, I get where athletic director Mike Babinski's coming from too. And from my resources over talking with Purdue fans, it seems pretty evident that everybody's pretty content with the Ryan Walters firing. And quite frankly, they had to do something. If you go into this season with Ryan Walters again, I already spilled the whole recruiting spiel about how difficult it would be to get all those players back up. And you'd be relying on the transfer portal so heavily to the point where it almost just wouldn't be worth it. So it seems like right now it's best to say, hey, experiment with Ryan Walters. It was it was all right, and he's done a lot for this Boilermakers program. You can tell the passion is there, and he truly tried to do the best that he can, but it was just not working out. So with that said, I'm asking myself as I'm thinking about this Purdue opening, who are the right fits for this program? And I did a video in North Carolina last week, and to me, the biggest difference between Purdue and North Carolina is what they both have in common is they both have to go after offensive minded guys. I think that would to me would be the most obvious. You are definitely going to be transforming in the recruiting cycle as well. But I think the biggest difference between Purdue and the North Carolina opening is if you're Purdue, I think you have to go for a slam dunk hire. And what I mean by a slam dunk hire is someone who is an experienced head coach who has won either on the NFL level or on the college football level consistently, and three, understands what it's like to build a program from the bottom up. So I have a couple different ideas in terms of who Purdue can go after, and I'm gonna get into it, but I'm gonna throw a couple surprisers that I don't think a lot of people would really consider. But I'm gonna give a couple reasons why I think the hire could make sense. Now, unlike the North Carolina video, there are a number of uprising coaches you can talk about that Purdue could consider for this job. You can talk about John Sumrall. You can talk about Jason Candle over at Toledo. You can talk about Charles Huff over at Marshall. But the reason I'm not considering any of these coaches is I think Purdue is in a little bit of a different spot in the sense if you're giving up $9 million to fire Ryan Walters, you're not going out and hiring, Jamie Chadwell or somebody like that. I would expect a pretty bold hire coming from this Purdue team who is desperate to win. And when Jeff Brom eventually, left for this job too, it was a big opening, and you're at the point now where they really have to make a move in terms of finding the right person too, because especially when you see the amount of immediate success that Indiana has, I'm sure Purdue and the NIL collective over there were all kind of sitting there saying to themselves, well, why can't that be us? Our in-state rival just did the same thing, so we should be just as aggressive. So here's 4 candidates that I have for this job that are experienced head coaches, have a winning pedigree to themselves, and also make sense for a number of different reasons. So the first thing I'm going to throw out there is I'm going to throw Rich Rodriguez out there. He started out at Michigan State, so he understands what it's like to win in the Big Ten, to recruit in the Big Ten, even though it's been a long time. He had a pretty ugly stint at Arizona, and I'm not going to get into the controversies there, but needless to say, that did not work out. And he's kind of resurrected himself, his career at Jacksonville State Gamecocks. They went from FCS to FBS, and now they're building a very respectable program down in the Conference USA, playing on Tuesday nights too. They have a ton of talent down there. They play with heart. They play with passion. And you can tell that these kids are really buying into Rich Rodriguez. And if I'm Purdue, I would give him a call. He's an experienced head coach. He's been in a lot of different situations, and he knows what it's like to build a program from the bottom up. So even though people can call this kind of a retread hire, and I think a lot of the pushback I'm going to get on this video are people going to claim these are retread hires. However, I think Rich Rodriguez makes sense for a number of different reasons, and I would definitely be surprised if they don't give him a call, especially given that Purdue would have a hell of a lot more resources than Jacksonville State was. And I'm sure Rich Rodriguez is loving what he's doing down in Jacksonville, Alabama. But at the same time, you kind of have to ask yourself, hey, he's in his 60s by now. This could be his one last opportunity to really get a group of 4 job and, try to make a run with it. Because worst case scenario, if you're Rich Rodriguez and it doesn't work out at Purdue, hey, you can retire, walk off to the sunset, and you still have had an amazing career. And the next candidate I'm going to be talking about too is probably a candidate that's going to piss off a lot of Iowa Hawkeye fans. But I'm going to throw Tim Lester out there, head coach at Western Michigan for a handful of seasons, just above 500. And obviously, we can talk about Iowa's offense all day in the sense that it has been very pedestrian for a number of seasons. People talk about Kirk Ferentz's offense being outdated since 1990. He still runs the same power run scheme adapted by Mike Shanahan, who is the head coach of the Denver Broncos and the Oakland Raiders. And Tim Lester, although statistically speaking, the offense has not been there statistically, you can definitely tell they've made some strides over at Iowa. I think part of the resistance or the issues that you have with Tim Lester Because you can talk about his stint with the Green Bay Packers too, but at the same time too, with Tim Lester, the offensive, statistically speaking, probably won't be there in the sense of, hey, it's not going to jump off the page at you or anything like that. But at the same time, he understands what it's like to recruit over there. He's had success at this level before, and if you're Iowa too, you're probably pretty indifferent about him. I mean, Kurt Ferentz, Tim Lester, he's going to have a job there as long as he wants to at this point. It's only his first year, so I'd be pretty shocked if they decide to make a move, especially seeing the quarterbacks that Iowa's had this year. They obviously believed in Cade McNamara way too long to the point where he just kept getting injured. And then Brandon Sullivan wasn't working out. And then they played Jackson Stratton versus Nebraska, and he definitely did not have his best game. And you can just definitely tell it was out of his element too. But if you want to go someone with more local who has some head coaching experience and maybe not a super bold hire, but somebody who has the right experience and can at least lead them in the right direction for a couple of years, I'll throw out Tim Lester. And then my next candidate too, again, it's not going to be these two are definitely more long shot candidates if you ask me. But I'm going to throw out Chip Kelly out there. The obvious pushback on it is, hey, he was at a now Big Ten program at UCLA where he refused to recruit, and the resources obviously weren't there in the sense of UCLA is also a much more academically rigorous school than Purdue in the sense that he's going to have very similar problems that he had at UCLA. So do I think that Chip Kelly would take the Purdue job? Probably not, but hey, it might be worth a call to say, hey, Chip, would you be willing to maybe come in as an offensive coordinator if you pay him a boatload of money or something like that? Because the thing is, Chip Kelly's in a perfect situation at Ohio State in the sense of, hey, maybe if they don't win the national championship, maybe Chip Kelly ends up being the head coach there, even though I definitely find that to be probably laughable. But at the same time, if you're Purdue, what's the hurt of Chip Kelly? I mean, he's had success in the NFL. He's had success at Oregon, UCLA for the first two seasons while he was there, and he understands what this current college football predicament is. I mean, he understands how difficult it is to win at the Big Ten level and just how quickly the game is changing. So he could be somebody that they go after too. And what I'm going to say is probably my favorite candidate of all is Paul Christ who used to be Wisconsin's coach, 67-26 while there. And I really like Paul Christ for a number of reasons for this hire. Number one, he has the offensive background that Purdue desperately needs in order to get themselves in the right situation. I definitely anticipate them using the recruiting transfer portal heavily. So if Purdue has any chance at being any sort of relevant for the next couple of seasons, you have to imagine them really dialing in on that. But what I like about Paul Christ more than anything, he's had success coaching in college football. He's had success in the NFL, and he also has a Canadian football background as well. And for those of you who don't watch Canadian football tends to use a lot more emotion, a lot more explosive plays, and it's a lot more difficult for the defense to be able to stop these players too, in the sense that the field is a lot more spread out and there's a lot more creativity that you can have on a Canadian football field. So I would definitely be surprised if they don't call Paul Christ, especially since he was on the short list for the Indiana job last season that ultimately went to Curt Cignetti. So if I'm Purdue, I would say Paul Christ should be your absolute number one target. He's proven that he can win in a number of different situations, like Pittsburgh, like Wisconsin. Very successful record, nonetheless. And he, in my opinion, exactly the background you're looking for. He's taken a year off of coaching, and all things considered, it should be a perfect situation for him. He understands the Big Ten. He has recruited in this area extensively, whether you want to talk about Pittsburgh or Wisconsin or where else he's been. And to me, it seems like a win-win for everybody. You're not going to have to pay the big amount of money that you would need for a Chip Kelly, or I'll even throw out John Gruden, for example. John Gruden even has some ties over to Dayton, Ohio, and went to high school in South Bend, Indiana. So maybe it could be a coming home story for John Gruden. And I guarantee you, he would probably take a discount for him to get back into college football. So if you're Purdue, there are a number of different avenues you can take. But I'd be giving Rich Rodriguez a call, try calling Tim Lester, maybe feel out Chip Kelly and John Gruden. But in my opinion, if I'm the Boilermakers, I'm going after Paul Christ, who is an experienced head coach, has a winning pedigree, and